Hello, dear story lovers. At the amount of 1,000 subscribers, I will post a huge series of special stories for you. Subscribe now. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a stale reminder of the world that once was. Concrete towers loomed like hollow skeletons, their windows shattered and walls scarred by time and conflict. Elara crouched in the shadow of a collapsed overpass, her sharp eyes scanning the ruins ahead. Her prey was close, she could feel it. Kale had been spotted earlier that morning by one of the few scavengers brave enough to venture into this desolate part of the city. The information had cost Elara half of her dwindling food supply, but the promise of what Kale carried, a map to salvation, was worth the gamble. Elara adjusted the strap of her crossbow and tightened her grip. She'd survived this long by being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone else. Today would be no different. The hunt was her domain, her sanctuary in a world stripped of everything else. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance. She pressed herself against the crumbled wall, her breath steady and shallow. Kale appeared, his silhouette cutting through the haze of the early evening. He was taller than she had imagined, his movements fluid and deliberate. He carried himself with a strange confidence, almost as if he were the one hunting her. Elara followed silently, weaving through the rubble. Her boots made no sound on the cracked asphalt. She kept her distance, her eyes trained on the man ahead. He paused occasionally, scanning his surroundings, and each time, she melded into the shadows, her heartbeat steady. She caught glimpses of him now and then, a sharp profile as he turned his head, the curve of his back as he crouched to inspect something on the ground. There was something unsettling about his composure. Most people in the wastelands moved with a frantic energy, driven by desperation. Kale was different. He seemed to move with purpose, as if the destruction around him held no power over him. Hours passed in a tense game of cat and mouse. Elara's stomach growled in protest, reminding her why she was here. The food she had left wouldn't last another week, and if the rumors were true, Kale's map was her ticket to survival. Yet, for all her focus, she couldn't shake a nagging curiosity about him. Who was this man who moved so assuredly in a world that devoured the weak? As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Kale disappeared into an old warehouse, its metal doors hanging precariously from rusted hinges. Elara crept closer, her crossbow raised. She had the advantage now, cornering him in the darkened structure. But as she approached, a faint sound stopped her in her tracks. Music! Elara blinked in disbelief. The gentle notes of a melody drifted out from the warehouse, soft and haunting. She hadn't heard music in years, not since the collapse. The sound froze her, a sharp contrast to the harsh silence of the wasteland. It wasn't just the melody, it was the audacity of it. Who, in this broken world, had the luxury to play music? Her grip on the crossbow faltered for a moment. Then she steeled herself and pushed the door open with a soft creak. Inside, the dim light filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating Kale sitting on a makeshift bench. In his hands was a weathered guitar, its strings producing the ethereal tune. He didn't look up but spoke, his voice calm and low. "You've been following me for hours. You must be tired." Elara froze, caught off guard. "How did you dash?" Kale finally lifted his gaze, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They weren't filled with fear or anger, but something else entirely. Curiosity, maybe. Or understanding. "I could feel you," he said simply, setting the guitar down. "You're good. But not invisible." Her crossbow remained raised, her finger hovering over the trigger. "You know why I'm here." Kale nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "The map. And whatever food you're carrying." He smiled faintly, a gesture that surprised her with its warmth. "You could have killed me out there." "You didn't." "Not yet," she said, The warehouse was silent, save for the soft creak of metal as Elara adjusted her stance. She kept her crossbow trained on Kale, even as her mind wrestled with the enigma sitting before her. His calm demeanor wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. A man with nothing to fear was either very dangerous or incredibly naive. Elara doubted Kale was the latter. "You said we have a lot to talk about," Elara said, her voice sharp, cutting through the thick tension. "Start talking." Kale leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I carry a map," he began. "But it's not just a piece of paper. It's a way out of this." He gestured to the ruins around them, his eyes briefly scanning the dimly lit warehouse. "There's a place hidden, untouched. Fertile land, clean water, safety. A place where people are rebuilding, not just surviving." Elara raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched into her features. "Sounds like a fairy tale. Why should I believe you?" Kale tilted his head, his gaze meeting hers with unflinching intensity. "You've been out there long enough to know that survival alone isn't enough anymore. The wasteland is dying. The scavengers, the marauders, the nomads, it's a slow collapse. You've felt it, haven't you? That gnawing edge of desperation?" Elara hesitated, his words striking closer to home than she cared to admit. She'd spent years outrunning that desperation, but lately, the cracks had started to show. Supplies were scarcer, encounters with marauders more frequent, and the loneliness always there had become a constant weight. Still, she wasn't about to let her guard down. "Even if this place exists, why haven't you gone there already?" Kale's lips tightened into a thin line. "Because I need help to get there. The route is treacherous, and the map is encoded. I've spent months piecing it together, but I can't do it alone." Elara smirked, her crossbow never wavering. "And what makes you think I'm the one to help you? I could just kill you now and take the map." Kale shrugged, his expression calm. "You could. But the map would be useless without me to decode it. Besides..." He leaned back, his hands resting on his thighs. "If you were going to kill me, you would have done it already. Something stopped you. I'm betting it's curiosity." Her jaw tightened, his words cutting uncomfortably close to the truth. Kale's confidence unnerved her, but there was something compelling about him, an intangible quality that made her hesitate. He wasn't like the desperate survivors she'd encountered before, willing to lie, steal, or kill without thought. He was different. Elara lowered her crossbow slightly, though her grip remained firm. "Suppose I believe you. What's in it for me?" Kale's gaze softened. "More than survival. A chance to live. To be part of something again." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elara's instincts screamed at her to walk away, or better yet, to end this now and take the map. But her heart, hardened though it was, wavered. She hated the emptiness that filled her nights, the aching loneliness that no amount of food or shelter could fix. "Fine," she said at last, her voice reluctant. "But let's get one thing straight. If this turns out to be a lie, I'll make sure you regret it." Kale nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Fair enough." The tension eased slightly as they began to plan their journey. Kale unrolled the map, revealing a tattered piece of parchment covered in strange markings and notations. He explained the encoded symbols, pointing out landmarks and warning signs. Elara listened intently, her sharp mind absorbing every detail. As the hours passed, the initial hostility between them gave way to a tentative camaraderie. They shared a meal of canned beans and stale crackers, a meager feast by any standard. Kale told her stories of the wasteland places he'd been, people he'd met. Elara found herself laughing, a sound she hadn't heard from her own lips in years. But as the firelight flickered in Kale's dark eyes, Elara felt an unease that had nothing to do with danger. It was the way he looked at her, not with fear or suspicion, but with a kind of quiet respect. It unsettled her, yet she couldn't bring herself to look away. Later that night, as they prepared to rest, Kale spoke softly. "You're not just hunting for food, are you?" Elara stiffened, her guard snapping back into place. "What's that supposed to mean?" Kale shrugged, his expression unreadable. It's just, I think you're searching for something more. Even if you don't realize it yet. She didn't respond, her silence sharp enough to cut. But as she lay awake under the cold, starless sky, Kale's words lingered. For the first time in years, Alara found herself questioning not just her actions, but her purpose. The rising sun painted the ruins in hues of orange and gold, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt. Alara and Kale set out at dawn, their mismatched packs slung over their shoulders, the weight of necessity keeping their steps measured. The wasteland sprawled ahead of them, a desolate expanse filled with dangers both seen and unseen. Kale led the way, his confidence in navigating the treacherous terrain bolstered by the encoded map he carried. Alara followed close behind, her crossbow within easy reach. Though an unspoken truce had formed between them, trust was a luxury she couldn't yet afford. The first few days passed in tense silence, broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot or the distant call of scavenger birds circling above. The wasteland offered little to sustain them, and their ration supplies dwindled quickly. Alara scavenged when she could, her sharp eyes spotting edible plants and signs of potential prey. Kale, for his part, proved resourceful in avoiding danger, guiding them away from marauder camps and known ambush spots. One evening, as they set up camp near the husk of an old factory, Alara couldn't hold back her curiosity any longer. "You're too prepared for this," she said, eyeing him over the small fire they'd managed to start. "You move like you've done this 100 times. Kale chuckled softly, the flames casting shadows across his face. "Maybe not 100, but I've spent most of my life out here. You learn quickly, or you don't survive." "Most people don't survive," Alara said bluntly. Kale's smile faded, replaced by a quiet sadness. "No, they don't." The weight of his words hung between them, and Alara didn't press further. She didn't need to. She recognized the pain in his voice, the kind born of loss and sacrifice. It was a feeling she knew all too well. The journey grew more perilous as they neared the coordinates marked on the map. The terrain shifted from flat wasteland to jagged cliffs and narrow passes. The air grew colder, and the nights stretched longer. They encountered their first real danger on the fifth day, a group of marauders lying in wait near a rusted bridge. Alara spotted them first, her sharp instincts picking out the glint of a blade and the faint movement in the shadows. She signaled to Kale, and they retreated to higher ground to plan their next move. "We could go around," Kale suggested, tracing a detour on the map. "But it'll add another day to our journey." Alara shook her head. "We're low on supplies as it is. We take them out." Kale hesitated. "That's risky. There are at least 6 of them, and we don't know how well armed they are." "I've handled worse," Alara said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You stay here and cover me if things go south." Kale looked like he wanted to protest, but nodded reluctantly. "Just be careful." Alara moved swiftly, using the cover of the rocks to get closer to the marauders. She picked them off one by one, her crossbow silent and deadly. By the time they realized they were under attack, only 2 remained. Kale joined the fray, a knife in hand, and together they dispatched the remaining threats. When it was over, Alara wiped the blood from her blade and glanced at Kale. Not bad for someone who wanted to play it safe. He grinned, his breathing heavy. "You didn't leave me much choice." They scavenged what they could from the marauders' ammunition, a few cans of food, and a flask of water. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between them gave way to a fragile camaraderie. They began to talk more during their long treks, sharing stories of their pasts. Kale spoke of his childhood in a small settlement that was overrun by raiders, of the people he'd lost and the lessons he'd learned. Alara, hesitant at first, eventually shared her own story, a tale of solitude and survival, of trusting no one and relying only on herself. "I thought it was the only way to stay alive," she admitted one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I'm not so sure." Kale didn't respond immediately. When he did, his words were gentle. It's hard to trust again after losing so much. But sometimes, it's the only way forward. Elara looked at him, her defenses slipping just enough to let his words sink in. She didn't reply, but the way she sat a little closer to the fire, her body angled slightly toward his, spoke volumes. The final leg of their journey brought them to the edge of a vast canyon. A narrow path wound down into the valley below, where green fields and flowing water stretched as far as the eye could see. Elara stared in disbelief, her breath catching in her throat. "It's real," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Kale smiled, the weight of the journey lifting from his shoulders. "I told you." As they began their descent, Elara felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, hope, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that there might be more to life than mere survival. And as Kale walked beside her, his presence steady and reassuring, Elara realized that her journey wasn't just about finding food or safety. It was about finding something she hadn't known she was searching for. The descent into the valley was slow and cautious. The path was narrow, flanked by steep drops on one side and jagged rock on the other. Elara led the way, her crossbow ready, though she doubted anything dangerous lurked here. The lush greenery below seemed almost untouched by the harshness of the wasteland above, a stark contrast to the desolation they had left behind. When they reached the valley floor, a wave of disbelief washed over them. The air was fresher, carrying the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. Birds chirped from the branches of thriving trees, their leaves a vibrant green. A river cut through the landscape, its clear waters sparkling in the sunlight. It was a paradise, a place neither had thought possible. "This," Elara whispered, her voice filled with awe. "This shouldn't exist." Kale chuckled softly, his gaze sweeping over the valley. "And yet, it does." They followed a faint trail through the fields until they reached the outskirts of a small settlement. Wooden fences surrounded patches of crops, and modest homes with shingled roofs stood in neat rows. People moved about, their faces marked by the weariness of survival but softened by a sense of purpose. Children laughed as they played near the riverbank, their joy a sound Elara hadn't heard in years. The settlers greeted them cautiously, their wariness understandable in a world so often defined by betrayal. Kale stepped forward, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. After some tense introductions, the settlers welcomed them in, offering food, water, and a place to rest. As the days passed, Elara and Kale began to integrate into the community. They worked alongside the settlers, helping to tend the crops and reinforce the fences. Elara, who had spent so long surviving on her own, found herself grappling with the unfamiliar sensation of belonging. She wasn't sure if it was the safety of the settlement or the people themselves, particularly Kale, that made her heart feel lighter. One evening, after a day of hard work, the community gathered around a central fire. Laughter and conversation filled the air, the sounds of a life Elara had thought long gone. Kale sat beside her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content to simply exist in the warmth of the moment. "You're quiet tonight," Kale said, breaking the silence. Elara glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Just trying to take it all in. It's been a long time since I've felt like this." "Like what?" "Safe," she admitted, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. Kale nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? After everything we've been through, to find a place like this, it feels unreal." Elara hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think it'll last?" Kale's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "I think it can. But only if we fight for it." His words resonated with her. Elara had spent years fighting for food, for survival, for every breath. But this was different. This was a fight for something worth keeping, something she didn't want to lose. The next morning, Elara found Kale by the river, his guitar in hand. He was strumming a soft melody, the sound blending with the murmur of the water. She approached quietly, her presence announced only by the crunch of her boots on the gravel. "You're up early," Cale said without looking up, his fingers dancing across the strings. "So are you," Elara replied, folding her arms. "Practicing your serenades?" He grinned, a boyish charm breaking through his usual composure. "Something like that." "Want to join me?" Elara raised an eyebrow. "I don't play." "Then sit," he said, gesturing to a spot beside him. "You can listen." Reluctantly, she sat, the two of them bathed in the golden light of dawn. Cale played for a while, the music soft and soothing. For once, Elara allowed herself to relax, the tension she always carried slipping away. When he finally set the guitar aside, Cale turned to her, his expression serious. "You know, you've changed." Elara frowned. "What do you mean?" "When we first met, you were guarded. Sharp edges everywhere, like you were afraid to let anyone get too close." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "But now, I see something different. Like you found something you didn't even know you were looking for." She looked away, his words striking a chord deep within her. "Maybe I have," she admitted softly. Cale reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was light but deliberate, and it sent a warmth through her she hadn't felt in years. "You hunted me for food," he said, a teasing smile on his lips. "But I think you found something else." Elara met his gaze, a faint smile of her own forming. "Maybe I did." The days turned into weeks, and Elara's place in the settlement and in Cale's life solidified. She still kept her crossbow close, her instincts honed by years of survival, but the hunger that had driven her for so long had changed. It wasn't the gnawing desperation for food or safety. It was a deeper hunger, one for connection, for purpose, for love. In the quiet moments, as she and Cale worked side by side or shared stories by the fire, Elara realized that she had found something far more precious than sustenance. She had found a reason to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for the future they were building together.